Hi, hello. Welcome to episode 6 of our Borderland Journey. This is the last episode in part 1 of the journey. Part 2, which will be another 6 episodes, will be along in a couple of months. So keep subscribed and we'll be dropping into your inbox before you know it. But now we set off from Dilwyn and turn right by the pub to head west to join the main road taking us towards Weobley, and passing the lane on our right which leads up to the Haven, the farm where Mrs. Leather and Raythorn Williams recorded William Hiron's singing his melancholy song Cold Blows the Wind, as we heard in the last episode. The Haven also happens to be the home to the oldest pedigree herd of Herefordshire cattle in the world, continuously bred on this farm since the early 19th century. We met the tough little Rydale sheep in our last episode, and now here is another historic inhabitant of these Marcher lands. They're beautiful animals with their rich red coats and white faces, and they're familiar now all over England, all over the world, but they're as much part of Herefordshire's history as black and white buildings or the depredations of England are, and they're a constant presence in the landscapes we pass through. Down in the city of Hereford, Hereford House is the home of the Herefordshire Cattle Society, and as you would expect, it's full of trophies of paintings of improbably huge prize bulls, all kitted out in their rosettes and fancy show gear, but it's also full of stories of these extraordinary tough and intelligent animals, including one which I still find almost unbelievable. In 1940, a consignment of pedigree Herefords was loaded onto a ship for transport to the United States to improve their national breeding stock. But, this was in the middle of the Second World War. It was a dangerous time to be attempting the crossing. British cargo ships were being ruthlessly targeted by the German Navy. But in spite of the risks to the ship, its crew, and its precious cargo, they joined the notorious North Atlantic convoys. But, like so many others, they didn't make it. They were torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat. The ship and most of the crew and cattle were lost, but 2 of the Herefords not only survived, but they swam back to Ireland, landing somewhere on the Causeway coast. They swam back from the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. How on earth did they know what direction to swim in? What incredible stamina, what tough animals. But we have to wave goodbye to our Herefords, and we can see the noble steeple of St. Peter and St. Paul's Church at Weobley, standing up tall on our left, an authoritative landmark for the country around. And we head west for a couple of miles, running parallel to the Newbridge Brook, which shows to our left as a little wandering crease in the rich green of the fields as it runs down to Dilwyn, where it joins the Stretford Brook, finally becoming part of the River Arrow down at Ivington, all part of the maze of pools and waterways in this valley landscape of pasture, orchard and meadow. We turn sharp left off the main road towards Weobley. The road jinks around on our way into the village, and we pass a striking timber-framed farmhouse resplendent in its original dusky pink Tudor colouring. And then we turn left to enter the town itself. Weobley has never been a big town. To be honest, it feels little more than a village. But it has been important. It still has a grand church, it has pubs and the remains of a motte and ring castle, and, crucial to life here now, a rural high school. In the Middle Ages, there was a fair and an important marketplace. The elaborate half-timbered market hall, which stood in the centre of the town, was demolished in the 1860s. What was it about this Victorian hatred of Herefordshire's grand ancient market houses? Hereford's astonishingly elaborate market hall was pulled down in the 1860s too. At least Lemster's was only dismantled and, fortunately, rebuilt elsewhere. But what remains here is spectacular. You're immediately aware of the historic nature of this little town. It's one of the crowning glories of the group of black and white villages, with an amazingly fine collection of half-timbered houses, many of them older than those surviving in larger towns. I hear they can be medieval, they can be 15th or even 14th century, wobbly, lopsided, propping each other up. Bell Square is an ancient marketplace to the north end of town, and standing here looking towards the main streets of Broad Street and High Street, there's a fine row of 15th and 16th century half-timbered buildings on our right, and they just reinforce the domestic and historic nature of this place. These are hall houses and cottages, houses where people still live. They're ancient, but they're not museum exhibits. They're homes with cars parked outside. This is a kind of historical normality, not a visitor attraction with all the life bled from it. If we turn north, we can walk away from the town centre down Church Road to the impressive church of St. Peter and St. Paul. And it is very imposing, especially with its massive 14th century tower, a statement of the power and authority of the church in the Middle Ages. It's as strong and dramatic as any castle keep, and topped with a tall spire of enormous elegance. Inside, the church is spacious, with an unexpectedly large chancel, but for me it's maybe more imposing than beautiful. But it's the memorials, the monuments to some of the great figures in Weobley's history which catch my imagination. There is a handsome figure of Sir Walter Devereux, Lord of Weobley, an important royal courtier, and one of the great lords of the marches, and he was killed by the army of Owen Glendower as he led his Weobley men to their deaths at the Battle of Bringlass in 1402, which is only about 20 miles northwest of here, just over the border into Powys. As we heard in episode 4, this was the battle in which Owen Glendower's ascendant armies routed the English in a dreadful and bloody slaughter. Here, Devereux is shown reclining on his slab in full armour, his feet resting on a recumbent lion, and his head on what remains of his great helm, all above a heraldic display on his tomb chest. And yeah, he's rather vandalised now. His face is blunted, toes and arms are gone, and he's been exposed to the indignity of copious 18th and 19th century graffiti, but he's still a noble figure. I always think the armour of the 14th and early 15th centuries is very stylish, whether you see it in illuminated manuscripts, stained glass memorial brasses, or as here, on a life-size stone monument. The tight jupon coat and low-slung jewelled belt, well, they're just very cool. But, beautiful as his armour is, it didn't save him at Bringlass. In 1383, as he was approaching middle age, he married Agnes Croppel when she was only 13. And after bearing him 8 children, 6 of whom survived to adulthood, she remarried following his death. I mean, she was still a young woman. And here she is in Weobley Church too, in marble effigy next to her third husband, Sir John Marbury. She was clearly an extraordinary person who acquired estates and titles throughout her long and productive life. It's not surprising that her effigy is shown in the most fashionable clothes and with a fabulous and elaborate hairstyle. Leaving the church, we turn left across the churchyard and join the lane just to the east end of the church, and from here we can walk south into the town itself. And as we walk along, we're confronted by one of the great examples of timber building in England. The gable end of this medieval hall house is formed by a massive and spectacular example of medieval cruck building. Here, a great oak tree trunk, trimmed into a gentle curve, has been split down its entire length to create a pair of huge wooden posts which, when you open them up, like the pages of a book, form a pointed arch, which is used to make the gable end of the building. And it just leaves you in awe, astonished really at the skill, the knowledge and craftsmanship of medieval foresters, how they managed, how they crafted this living resource. I mean, timber in all its forms was so important, from the great structural posts for buildings like this to the thin, whippy willow, hazel and oak ones used in basket making. Everything needed management, all needed nurturing, all needed planning. And whether you were tending a wood for coppicing over a dozen years, or a great oak forest for half a century, your harvest had to be ready to be cut or felled at the right moment, and in sympathy with the rhythms and timing dictated by nature, by the natural world. And, of course, this building, a living tribute to the strength and durability of oak, was already standing when Lord Devereux met his end in 1402. Walking up Broad Street as the road opens up, there is a sense, almost like nowhere else, of what a townscape was like before the 19th century, before Victorian expansion and the intrusion of modern planning. But Weobley's sense of historic identity is more than just as a showpiece of ancient buildings. The town has more than its share of superstitions, of folk tales and folk song, of hauntings, devils, strange happenings and customs, all collected by that tireless saviour of rural culture, Mrs. Ella Leather, who lived here in Weobley until her death in 1928, in Castle House up on the Hereford Road. Her folklore of Herefordshire is full of stories of Weobley people and places, their rituals and beliefs. Among them, she records an account of a haunting by the demon of Burton Farm, as described in a letter of 1670. The farmer was plagued by bad luck and unlucky portents, but one day, one of his pigs, a sow, got up to dance, and she leapt and danced in strange postures, eventually falling down dead, and the farmer finally decided to call for help. And the letter goes on, one John Jones, a valiant Welshman, undertook to keep watch with a sword, a mastiff dog, and a lantern. And he hadn't lain long on the bed when he heard a knocking at the door, and, as he conceived, many cats came into his chamber. They broke the windows and made a hideous noise. The mastiff howled, the candle went out, the Welshman fell into a cold sweat, left the sword unused, and with much ado found the door and ran half a mile without looking behind him, protesting the next day he wouldn't be another night in the house for £100. The letter ends, as do so many accounts of the uncanny, with, "These particulars I received from eyewitnesses of unquestionable credit, and you may no more doubt the truth of them than distrust the affection of your humble servant, J.A." Written at Hereford, March 1670. I wonder who J.A. was. Someone who liked a good gossip, I imagine. And Weobley was also the hometown of the mysterious Mr. Jenkins, the clever man, the layer of ghosts and fetcher of witches, well known to Mrs. Leather. We first met him in Bodenham, laying ghosts in episode 3. Weobley is indeed a town of strange tales and marvels. But we leave the town, heading south to turn left by the Unicorn pub, then right onto Hereford Road, passing on our right Ella Leather's house and the great grass-covered mound which is all that remains of Devereux's proud Weobley Castle. We wind along the valley's edge and then begin a gentle climb through the orchards of King's Pion and up the flank of Wormsley Hill, cutting through Ostywood on the road which is beautifully named Raven's Causeway. And as we climb, the view opens up on our left, and we can look out over the broad valley of the River Arrow, the landscape punctuated by a series of neat wood-topped conical hills rising up from the valley water meadows and orchards, Pion Hill, Chadner Hill, and Butthouse Knap. Hidden in a fold of the hills on our right is the site of Foxley Camp. This country seems so quiet, so rural and peaceful, that it's difficult to imagine that a little over 60 years ago this place was buzzing. An American military hospital was turned into accommodation, firstly for hundreds of Polish refugees who had managed to escape from the disasters of the Nazi and Russian invasions, and then, by 1950, into temporary homes for displaced families, homeless due to the housing shortage of the time, who joined the Polish community to create a vibrant and bustling township in the middle of a wooded valley. There were cinemas, shops, schools, a library, regular bus services into Hereford. But by the 1960s, the camp was closed, the buildings deserted and demolished. All that remains now are the ghostly footings of the huts that housed so much life. The camp was built on part of the Foxley estate, and that was the country seat of the Price family. The grand 18th century mansion, Foxley House, was demolished in 1948. But a short way up the track that leads from Foxley Camp is the handsome brick stable block, a formal and elegant quadrangle, and all that remains now to remind us of the grandeur of the estate. Well, not quite all. There is a little Gothic gazebo, ragged castle, hidden now in the woods to the south, built as a romantic and picturesque eye-catcher in the 1740s. And Foxley, perhaps unexpectedly, is fundamental to our understanding of the English landscape. It was the home during the late 18th and early 19th century of Sir Weobley Price, who, in many ways, helped to form our understanding of landscape as an aesthetic experience. The idea of landscape, its range, its beauty, its constantly changing character, is absolutely fundamental to our journey, to English journeys generally. But it wasn't that long ago that the idea of the countryside was perceived very differently as something to be managed, to be farmed or indeed avoided. The value of the timber, how challenging the land was to work, the ease of ploughing, of drainage, the productivity of the soil, these were the considerations, not what it looked like. Was it beautiful? Was it inspiring? Yeah, why should anyone care? But attitudes began to change in the 18th century, partly as a result of the fashion for travel in Europe on the Grand Tour. For the rich and influential, crossing the Alps, travelling through Italy, came to be seen as an aesthetic act. Experiencing the sublime horrors of a storm in the St. Gotthard Pass or the calm, sunlit beauty of the Roman Campagna. And these opposing aspects of nature, the sublime and the beautiful, came to dominate artistic discussion and the practice in England of landscape painting, landscape design. You could, after all, find, sublime shock and awe standing on, the great horseshoe crag of Cadair Idris as you were battered by sun, rain and hail, or you could find beauty in the gentle undulations of the Thames Valley. And if you didn't have a beautiful view, then Lancelot Capability Brown could come along and build one for you. But Weobley Price argued that landscape was more complex, was richer, and he developed the idea of the picturesque. It wasn't just the extremes of the sublime or beautiful that delighted, it was the awkwardness of nature, the crooked trees, the deep lanes, the rocky outcrops, tumble-down cottages, variations in colour and texture, the rich variety of English landscape. In fact, the landscapes that you can find in the Wye Valley in particular, especially further south on the Wye's course through towards the sea into the wooded gorges of Simon's Yat, past the ruins of Goodrich Castle and Tintern Abbey, the rugged cliffs of Chepstow Reach. Weobley Price eventually published his arguments in triumph, and the Wye Valley became the archetypal picturesque landscape, perhaps the very first English landscape to attract a serious reputation as a tourist destination in its own right. Continuing on Raven's Causeway as the road turns right, we have the full glory of a view over rolling country laid out for us, a picturesque view if ever there was one. And as Raven's Causeway rises and falls, we begin to drop down into the valley of the River Wye, and in about a mile we turn right, passing the beautiful moated manor house of Brinsop Court on our left, and we head towards the tiny hamlet of Brinsop and its gorgeous little church of St. George. We're heading now into what was a busy place in ancient Roman times. Ahead of us was the town of Magnes, and traces of Roman villas have been found all around Brinsop, with mosaic floors and comfortable rooms heated by underfloor hypercaust systems. And there is more and more modern history to be discovered here. History and poetry, because the poet William Wordsworth, his family and friends, were regular visitors to Brinsop. Sarah Hutchinson, the sister of Wordsworth's wife Mary, lived at Brinsop Court. Wordsworth, his sister Dorothy, and Mary were frequent visitors, with Dorothy often prolonging her stays for months at a time, delighted with the company of the Hutchinson family. And Sarah was clearly a likeable woman, pretty, vivacious, and energetic, and the subject of a passionate but hopeless and unrequited love of Wordsworth's friend, the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The Irish poet Edward Quillinan, who became Wordsworth's son-in-law, was also a regular visitor. But sometimes tragedy intervened. A favourite family dog, Prince, developed a particular affection for Dorothy Wordsworth, and he would lie outside her bedroom door, and when he sensed that she was preparing to travel back to Cumbria, he would hide himself amongst her luggage in her carriage, only being discovered when their carriage arrived in Hereford. But Prince became old and ill. The master of the house, Thomas Hutchinson himself, an invalid after a riding accident, became increasingly impatient. The dog, he said, had to go. But young George Hutchinson, Thomas's nephew, loved Prince, and had always managed to put off the dreadful day and pleaded for mercy on Prince's behalf. But finally, when George was away on an errand, Thomas instructed one of the servants to send Prince on his way. Quite why Jerry Priest decided that the way to kill the dog was to hang it from one of the trees in the garden, I can't imagine. But of course, George came back, and, asked to fetch some words as fishing bait by Quillinan, came face to face with poor Prince, dangling by his neck and swaying in the breeze. Beside himself with distress, perhaps George found comfort in Quillinan's poem, written on the spot, his epitaph to a favourite dog. Stop, passenger, and drop a tear. A most ill-fated prince lies here. His reign in youth was wild and pleasant. He hunted rabbit, hare, and pheasant. Grown old, he bid adieu to sport, and mildly ruled at Brinsop Court. But shame on these reforming times of revolutionary crimes. This harmless, old, and good Prince Royal was vilely used by hands disloyal. His noble neck was hempen collared, and stretched upon a willow pollard. O wicked traitor Jerry Priest, repent if you would die in peace. I'm not sure that would have done the trick, really, but I dare say it was well meant. And the Wordsworths associations also included St George's Church in Brinsop. They worshipped there regularly, were active supporters, and a memorial stained glass window to Dorothy, Mary, and Sarah was installed in recognition of the ladies' devotion to the church. And the church is really lovely, with an unexpectedly rich and intriguing interior for such a secluded setting. There is exquisite 1920s ordering and decoration by Ninian Comper, and some robust sculpture by the early medieval Herefordshire school. It's a tympanum, presumably moved, either from an earlier building or from elsewhere, and now set into the north wall, carved with a powerful depiction of St George mounted on a great charger, spearing a dreadful dragon. And there are two beautiful medieval stained glass figures incorporated into the east window, one a female saint, and the other, of course, was St George, because Brinsop's great claim to fame is that this is the spot where St George killed the dragon. I mean, we're told, of course, that St George was a figure from the Caucasus or Eastern Mediterranean, and the whole story of dragon slaying is just a metaphor for overcoming the remains of paganism in the East. But we know that St George was English, and that he slayed an English dragon in these green hills. And the dragon lived in the well, in the meadow just to the west of the church. and the great battle took place in the fields behind. And yeah, why not? The Old English word for dragon was worm, and there are many worm place names around here. Wormsley is just up the road, and then there are Wormbridge, Wormlow. This is a county full of dragons. And once again, we can feel the shadow of J.R.R. Tolkien falling on us. Not so much the Tolkien of The Lord of the Rings, but of Farmer Giles of Ham, or even of his essays on Beowulf. Here we live in the stuff of legend. But now we must leave Brinsop, its church backed by the dark bulk of Credon Hill prehistoric hill fort, and also leave this part 1 of our Borderland journey. The road now runs down to the broad country of the Wye Valley. The western Herefordshire hills rise misty and inviting beyond, shielding the mysteries of Arkenfield and the Golden Valley. But that will all be happening in part 2. In the meantime, the English Journeys podcast is directed, produced and engineered by Mike Ellis. It's written and spoken by me, Martin Ellis, and we have loved having your company on the way, and look forward to travelling together again when we continue our journey in Borderland, part 2.